A small city car is rarely born out of ambition. It's born out of necessity. Wherever and whenever there's a demand for cheap, compact, and practical transportation, this type of vehicle inevitably finds its place. The Soviet Union had one too. Born from a purely functional need, it quietly entered the country's automotive landscape, and for a brief moment became a real part of it. But its moment didn't last long. In the Soviet Union, a car wasn't just a way to get around. It was a symbol of prestige and status. First, to save up 6 or 7,000 rubles on a monthly salary of 120 to 150, an entire family had to save, often by putting aside one person's full income. Second, even if you had the money, you couldn't just walk in and buy a car. You had to wait in line for 5 years or more. Unless, of course, you had special services to the motherland. Third, cars like the Lada and Moskvich were never designed to be affordable models. Their prices said it all. 5,000 rubles before the 1979 price hike, and up to 7,000 after. The only relatively affordable option was the Zaporozhets. But by the 1980s, it had become hopelessly outdated, even by Soviet standards. To keep it from falling out of demand completely, the government started lowering its price from 5,800 rubles in 1979 to 5,600 in 1984, and finally to 3,900 by 1987. But that wasn't generosity. It was desperation. Even the Zaporozhets still had a queue, albeit shorter than the one for a Lada. People still had to wait 2 to 3 years. Now imagine this. Just a few years ago, you could get a Lada for 5,000 rubles after waiting in line. And now, for the same money, all you get is a Zaporozhets. No wonder the price had to be cut, just to keep buyers from feeling completely ripped off. By the way, I'm preparing a full video explaining why Soviet cars were always in short supply, and why you couldn't just go out and buy one. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The idea of creating a compact, front-wheel drive car, something quite unusual for the USSR, emerged in 1968. It came from Vladimir Solovyov, the first chief designer at Lada. The project was mostly educational. Solovyov noticed that talented young engineers were growing bored without a major challenge. The Lada 2101 had just entered production, and no new large-scale developments were planned. To keep the team engaged, Lada management issued a real technical brief, with strict deadlines, cost estimates for the project and for production, even though no one seriously considered mass-producing the Lada 1101. It became the first car designed entirely in Togliatti, without help from foreign partners. Everything in the prototype was original. A brand new engine with a displacement of 0.9 liters and about 50 horsepower was mounted transversely, for the first time ever in the USSR. A team led by Mikhail Korzov developed a whole family of engines, ranging from 0.9 to 1.1 liters. A new 4-speed gearbox was designed from scratch. The front suspension used an original McPherson setup. The steering system came from a Zaporozhets, but was heavily modified. Even the seats were uniquely designed. Just before the new year of 1972, a small, slightly bug-eyed little car rolled out of the experimental workshop. It was nicknamed Cheburashka. After limited road tests, a long list of problems emerged, the kind you're seeing on screen right now. But in fixing these flaws, the developers, without knowing it, were laying the groundwork for future best-selling Soviet cars. In 1973, the second prototype appeared, the Lada 2E1101, with an upgraded engine producing 55 horsepower and a redesigned body. The car now bore a resemblance to the Fiat 127, and even to the future Niva, whose prototype it would soon become. In 1976, the third prototype was built, the Lada E1101 hatchback, officially named Lada Oka. It strongly resembled the Tavria, which would not appear until more than a decade later. And that's no coincidence. By order of the Ministry of Automotive Industry, Lada engineers were assigned to help their colleagues in Zaporizhzhia develop the future Tavria. The Ladoga was sent there as well. Even the Ladoga's designer transferred to ZAZ plant and became head of the new styling department, the Future Design Bureau. So even though this project was never intended for production, it ended up playing a key role in shaping both the Niva and the Tavria. But in reality, the Lada 1101 had nothing to do with the Oka. In fact, the story of the Oka didn't even begin inside Lada's design bureau. It all started back in the late 1970s, when the Serpukhov motorcycle plant, acting on a directive from the Soviet Ministry of Automotive Industry, began developing a completely new type of vehicle for disabled drivers. This new car was intended to replace the outdated Invalidka, which had drawn heavy criticism from users for its poor build quality and overall crude design. However, the ministry understood that Serpukhov simply lacked the production capacity and technological capability to develop and manufacture anything close to a modern car, at least not one built to conventional automotive standards, rather than the bare-bones motorized wheelchair approach of the past. The plan from the beginning was for the Oka to be a real car. Small, yes, but complete. Not just a glorified cart with a motorcycle engine and a flimsy shell. That's when Viktor Polyakov, the Minister of Automotive Industry, made a strategic move. He issued a top-down order involving the Lada plant in Tolyatti, the most advanced car maker in the Soviet Union, to take part in the development of this small-class vehicle for disabled citizens. There were several reasons for this decision. Serpukhov's obvious limitations, Lada's quiet interest in building such a model, and ultimately, Polyakov's own vision for a modern, inclusive Soviet automobile. Originally, the Oka was planned to be produced at 3 different plants: at Lada itself, at SMZ in a version for disabled drivers, and at KamAZ. Interestingly, it was KamAZ who volunteered to be the 3rd manufacturer. No one from above forced the heavy truck factory to take on the production of a subcompact car. KamAZ proposed it on their own initiative. The reason was that, in the USSR, there was a mandatory government order for every industrial plant, including even defense and aerospace facilities, to produce consumer goods for the population. In simple terms, a factory making aircraft engines, trucks, or military-grade radio equipment was also required to manufacture civilian and household items alongside its primary production. Some plants, as a side job, produced chainsaws, others made kitchen utensils. For example, the Moskvich plant produced children's pedal cars, and the Zaporozhye plant made toy cars. There were 2 reasons for this policy. First, producing civilian goods at military or industrial factories served as a sort of cover for their real activities. And second, since defense facilities employed the country's top engineers and designers and were generously funded, the idea was to make sure these brilliant minds contributed to the civilian sector as well. By assigning the production of household goods to these elite plants, the government aimed to give the average Soviet citizen access to better designed products. Naturally, KamAZ was also obligated to manufacture goods for the public. But instead of making dolls or kitchen mixers, they proposed setting up Oka production at their own plant and received official approval to do so. Each of the 2 industrial giants was expected to build around 20,000 cars per year, while the Serpukhov plant would make another 10,000 annually. Thus, the total yearly output of the Oka was planned at about 50,000 units. Not a huge number, but not small either, considering the niche nature of such a vehicle. The starting point for the Oka project was a government decree titled Resolution Number 575 on the creation of production capacities for a new special small-class vehicle in 1986 to 1988. Naturally, the leading role in developing the future car was assigned to Lada. This was inevitable, both for subjective and objective reasons. Of the 3 factories involved, Only the Tolyatti plant had the necessary experience and qualifications to develop such a car according to the technical specifications and bring it to full-scale production. That said, when it came to the vehicle's disability focus, no one in the country had more expertise than the engineers from SMZ, not even the specialists at Lada. That's why all aspects related to hand controls were handled by SMZ experts, temporarily assigned to Lada. These SMZ engineers didn't arrive in Tolyatti empty-handed. They brought with them their own prototype of the Oka, a design initially created in collaboration with the NAMI Institute. However, the SMZ 1101 turned out to be objectively unsuitable for mass production at a modern car plant. So the team at Lada decided to reboot the project from scratch. The technical assignment for the Oka defined its layout and key parameters, although engineers had considerable freedom in technical solutions. The main requirement was that the future car had to fit within the specified dimensions, no longer than 3.3 meters and with a curb weight of around 650 kilograms. It also had to be front-wheel drive and powered by a 2-cylinder, 4-stroke engine. As for the body, the requirements were quite different from what SMZ traditionally produced. It had to be a closed, 2-door, 4-seat car with a unibody design. The Oka's layout and concept, with its transversely mounted powertrain, front McPherson struts, and other hallmarks of an 80s car, are well known enough that it's worth focusing only on the power unit. For the first time in Soviet automotive history, a 2-cylinder, 4-stroke water-cooled engine was designed entirely from scratch. Naturally, after a series of experiments with an original design, the Lada engineers turned to the newest engine at the time, the 1.3-liter unit from the Samara, as a basis for simplification and faster development. Of course, components like the cylinder block and the crankshaft or camshaft from the 4-cylinder engine wouldn't fit, but everything else from the Samara was used to the fullest extent possible. As a result, the new engine was essentially half a Samara engine, which explains its displacement of 650 cubic centimeters. The motor also turned out to be very compact, allowing engineers to find room under the Oka's tiny hood for a spare wheel. In many ways, the Oka's layout and engineering solutions resemble Japanese microcars, specifically, not just in general spirit, but in direct reference to one particular model, the Daihatsu Quarry. This car was used as a benchmark during early prototype testing of the NAMI version of the Oka. There was no direct copying, of course. The Japanese and Soviet factories had vastly different manufacturing capabilities, and their engineering traditions diverged significantly. Still, it's clear even today that the Quarry served as a guiding reference, setting key dimensions and parameters. The first prototypes appeared in 1984. The so-called 100 series, after road testing, revealed serious issues with the rear suspension. These were addressed in the 200 series in 1985, and by 1986, the 300 series was introduced, essentially ready for mass production. The launch of the Oka into mass production came at a very unfortunate moment, right in the middle of the USSR's shift from a planned economy to a market-driven one. In 1987, just as 3 factories were preparing to begin series production of the Oka, the state officially ended financial support for the auto industry. Surviving in those conditions was hard enough. Introducing a completely new model was even harder. And yet, in 1988, KamAZ managed to build the first pre-production batch of the tiny car under its own name, Kama. That same year, the July cover of the magazine Za Rulem proudly featured the almost production-ready Oka, sparking a wave of public interest. The main question everyone asked was, how much will it cost and where can I buy one? Despite the fact that Lada had assembled a pilot batch of 200 units back in 1988, and that Serpukhov produced around 100 specially adapted cars for disabled drivers in 1989, the Oka remained an elusive novelty. it was never quite available for purchase as a proper shelf-ready product. And that was doubly frustrating, because with a price of just 2,500 rubles, the Oka was considerably cheaper than even the cheapest Lada, while offering vastly superior urban practicality. Of course, that's assuming you saw it for what it really was, a city microcar. Its modest payload, unimpressive performance, and tiny 12-inch wheels with three-lug mounting meant the Oka never felt at home outside the urban jungle or off paved roads. Still, many drivers were ready to embrace this cute and nimble queen of traffic jams. But by the late 1980s, the country was beginning to spiral into crisis. And by 1991, the USSR ceased to exist, which profoundly affected the car's future. Lada itself stopped producing the Oka relatively early. By 1995, it had switched those production lines to powertrain assembly and shifted focus to the Samara lineup, which was both more popular and more profitable. Oka production continued at two other factories, in Serpukhov and KamAZ. At SMZ, both regular and disabled-friendly versions of the Oka were manufactured for years to come. You know what's also interesting? While the base Lada Oka was being launched at three different factories, the USSR was simultaneously working on another compact car that could be produced at entirely different facilities and in much smaller volumes. In fact, a fourth plant was supposed to start building its own version of the Oka. The site chosen for this project was the Elabuga tractor plant, under construction since 1984. This slightly different Oka received the working index 1112. The key difference was the engine. Instead of a halved Samara engine, the new car was supposed to feature an all-new 0.82-liter three-cylinder engine, producing 40 horsepower. Beyond the engine, this version also had some notable technical differences from the standard Oka. For example, it was designed with glued-in windows instead of rubber seals, a step that significantly increased the structural rigidity of the body. But the entire project was eventually shut down for a simple reason: the collapse of the Soviet Union. Only 6 prototypes of the Elabuga Oka 1112 were ever built. In fact, all 3 factories experimented with different engines for the Lada Oka, since the standard 2-cylinder unit didn't satisfy every customer. There were attempts to install the engine from the Tavria, Chinese engines in later Oka versions, and even some trials with a 2-cylinder diesel. Still, the halved Samara engine remained the base power plant for nearly the entire production run of the Oka. Serial production of the standard Oka continued almost unchanged well into the 21st century. In the 2000s, during the car's final years on the assembly line, manufacturers did their best to make it more appealing to buyers. They added unique body kits, alloy wheels, improved interior trim, an instrument cluster with a tachometer, power windows, and even experimented with a convertible version. These upgrades did give the little car some extra comfort and style, but they also pushed up its price, often compromising its original idea: affordability. Out of all the facelift attempts, perhaps the most balanced one came from the Serpukhov plant in 2006. That version featured a Chinese 3-cylinder, 1-liter engine, and a rather pleasant redesign. Unfortunately, it never went into production. Only one prototype was made. Beyond restyling, there were also 2 serious attempts to create a next-generation Oka. The first came in 1992. A non-running concept called Oka 2 was made in the then-trendy bio-design style. But to be honest, it didn't look great. The second attempt was in 2003, and this time the prototype turned out unusually well-balanced and attractive. This car could have become a worthy and timely successor to the old Oka, but sadly, the factory simply didn't have the money to put it into production. It's also worth highlighting the attempts by KamAZ and the Serpukhov plant to produce a pickup version of the Oka. There were countless efforts to turn the Oka into a light truck, but none of them led to anything for fairly obvious reasons. Sure, the Oka pickup was cheap, but its cargo space and payload were laughable. Honestly, it's hard to imagine what kind of task this tiny utility vehicle could have been useful for, especially considering there were much more practical alternatives on the market. Yes, they cost a bit more, but at least they could actually carry something. Export wasn't exactly a success story for the OK. Despite Lada's vast dealership network across Europe, and even around the world, the OK was never officially offered outside the borders of the former USSR. And if it ever did reach a foreign market, it was more of an experiment than a serious campaign. But there was one exception: the United States. Not in its original form, though. A Nevada-based company called Oka Auto USA offered the OKZEV, a zero-emissions vehicle. Essentially, it was just a regular OK, but instead of an internal combustion engine, it was powered by an electric motor fed by 8 batteries. The car could reach speeds of 40 to 50 kilometers per hour, with just enough range to drop kids off at school or make a grocery run. That was the core use case it was marketed for. Even more surprising, as recently as 2024, the company's website was still listing vehicles marked as 2016 model year. It's unlikely they were still in production. Most likely, they were still selling off vehicle kits imported back in the late 2000s. And just recently, in June 2025, photos surfaced from a scrapyard in Colorado showing several Oka vehicles, including a pickup. Whether they were electric or gasoline-powered remains unclear. In fact, it's unclear how they even ended up there in the first place. By 2006, the Oka's life cycle was coming to an end in its home country, Russia. Production at KamAZ continued until that same year, when stricter environmental standards were introduced. The carbureted little car simply couldn't comply with the Euro 2 regulations. In Serpukhov, however, there was an effort to meet both the spirit and the letter of the times. The Oka was fitted with a Chinese-made, 3-cylinder fuel-injected engine that met the ecological standards. But the new powertrain drove the price of the already outdated Oka to an uncompetitive level. Sales volumes of the now expensive car dropped sharply, and production fell below the break-even point. Government orders for the special needs versions also practically ceased. Capitalist Russia had entered a new era, and the days of free cars for people with disabilities were basically over. To make matters worse, the global financial crisis hit in 2008, and the Oka never recovered. Production in Serpukhov was shut down entirely, and the plant switched solely to spare parts manufacturing. And so, one of the few but very symbolic microcars of the USSR disappeared into history. Appearing at the very end of the Soviet Union's existence, the Oka simply didn't have enough time to become what it could have been. Yet its distinctive two-box silhouette, with those small, thoughtful-looking headlights recessed at right angles into a black-framed front fascia, remained in the hearts of many drivers for years, especially those for whom the Oka was their very first car. Even as fate eventually led them to faster, more expensive vehicles, the little Oka stayed in their memory, because what it offered was the most important thing of all: the feeling of having a real car of one's own.